As you know, this is a kind of preview presentation of the guide we are creating to creating and revising governance documents. Um, Okay, so kind of the context for this, we have been asked repeatedly for specifically for templates for governance documents. And so that was kind of what I originally set out to do, was to talk to people about their experience creating, using, and revising governance documents, and then create a set of templates that people can just fill in the blanks and go on their merry way. Um, as I put in the description, that is not what we ended up doing. Thanks to lots of feedback, pretty much all of our interviewees said templates are really not a good idea for something like this, and we'll get into a little bit about why. But in my exploration for this project, I did 17 informal interviews, and then I also did kind of an informal document analysis of 17 documents from 8 different collaboratives where I really dove into individual governance documents. The goal for this is to eventually create a guide. Right now, that guide is about 8 pages of very messy word vomit that I am working on whittling down into what I hope will be a set of like guiding questions that people can use, examples that people can use. I'm going to try and keep it super short and sweet and really practical. It will not be anything resembling like a peer-reviewed paper. So I hope that people will really like it. And I do want to get feedback at the end of this to hear how I might make it the most accessible to everyone that I can. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about governance documents, what they are, why they're important, go through the process that people tend to go through. And then I've come up with some guiding questions that can kind of help you come up with the content that I've seen included in most of the governance documents. I'll talk about challenges and mistakes that we've seen. And then sprinkled throughout this presentation, I've put kind of quotations and nuggets of wisdom from our interviewees. I've got a couple of real examples in here, and then at the end, I will ask for your feedback. And I'll warn you in advance, this is kind of a dense presentation. I got weirdly very excited about governance documents during this project, so bear with me. So like I stated before, governance documents should be very customized. This is not a set of templates. There's no one size fits all. And we're going to get into why. So my personal definition of governance documents, this is not like a super formal definition, but from everything I've gathered, the most simple way to put it is that governance documents should be a tool to guide the way that your collaborative operates. And they really should be seen as a tool. They shouldn't be overly formal or overly vague. It's really something to guide how you work on the day-to-day basis. For a reference of what I'm talking about when I say governance documents, examples of what you might see are charters, strategic plans, bylaws, policies. They go by lots of different names, and I kind of use the term governance documents very broadly for this presentation. So one of the questions that I asked when I interviewed people was, when do you tend to lean on your governance documents versus when do they tend to sit on a shelf? And so I'm going to go through a few examples of the most common times that people actually use their governance documents. The main one is for decision-making, coming to consensus, and also guiding the collaborative through what happens if you can't reach a consensus. Another one that surprised me is that they were really used often for onboarding new partners or new board members. So if there's turnover, governance documents are a really easy thing to point to say, here's who we are, here's what we do, here's how you can expect to work together. It can also formalize commitments, particularly with like agency partners. They can be used to address inappropriate behavior in meetings and also to guide people through like how to deal with conflict. They can also put up sideboards to help stick to the scope of projects. Kind of the nature of a collaborative is to bring together a whole bunch of different partners and perspectives. And so governance documents can help say, hey, within this group, these are the types of projects we focus on, and other things you might just have to deal with as your own thing. And then they also come in handy when receiving like grant money. Some grants either like to see collaboration or require collaboration. So governance documents can be helpful there, as well as if the broader collaborative gives out money to like member organizations, it can be helpful to have fair guidelines for how they're going to give that away. So that's kind of the why collaborative governance documents are important. And then I think a lot of people just feel like, where do I even begin? How do I start creating governance documents from scratch? How do I go about revising documents that I know need revisions? And so I'm going to talk a little about the process. Um, I want to note that this is definitely not a prescription. This is maybe the least prescriptive part of the whole presentation, although none of it is prescriptive. Um, I'm just going to talk about the process that through my 17 interviews, I've pretty much seen the same pattern emerge most of the time. And so this is like, might be a good idea, but you kind of got to figure out what works for you. The first step in the process is determining if you're even ready for governance documents. People often, I think, see governance documents as like this thing that you have to have, but nobody quite knows why you have to have it. So I'm not going to get into like the stages of readiness framework and all of that good stuff right now, but it is important to think about like, is this a tool that you need in your toolbox right now? Would it be better to focus on relationships for a while first, and try and figure out like when is the right time to come up with governance documents? So once you decide you are, typically the way that I have seen this work or heard about it working is starting with some big picture group discussion to get an idea of what people want out of these documents, what they need out of these documents. But then you have to start somewhere. And so typically a coordinator or like a small team of dedicated people who care about governance will start by making a first draft based on the big picture group discussion. And then from there, that gives you somewhere to start. It gives you something to work on. And so then that goes out to the larger group. And then it typically takes several iterations of back and forth and a little bit of wordsmithing and kind of nailing down the specifics. So this was a quote that I liked from one of the people that I talked to. He said, "The process of writing governance documents shows small differences in opinions, and we like to let that play out because it brought out the membership's ability to argue." And I thought that was interesting. He went on to talk about how, obviously you want to keep a lid on it, but it's kind of an opportunity for maybe a membership that's historically always gotten along really well. And it's the kind of a chance to experiment with like pushing back on things people are saying or, figuring out how we all work together in times where maybe we don't all agree. So this is my first sprinkling of advice. So these advice pages are more like specific situations. So the first one is to check up front for who has authority in the room versus who's going to have to run things up the chain. For example, like if I'm in the room and I say, yeah, I'm the key point of contact on this, but at the end of the day, I'm going to have my boss's boss's boss at the university actually sign it. That's really good to know up front. And you still want to have me in the room, but you also need to make sure that the person with authority is on the same page so that you're not blindsided when they come through and say, oh yeah, actually, Katie did not know what she was talking about with this particular contract. Another piece of advice or encouragement in this case is that things tend to get messy right before they all come together. So hang in there. But on the other hand, don't be afraid to call a timeout if you feel like things are just talking in circles and you're kind of rehashing the same thing over and over. There is a time and place to just say, let's pause this discussion for now. We'll think about it and let's make a decision on this next time. So it's all about balance. You do want to invest time in making the documents robust, and you want to be patient as you go through revisions because revisions mean people care. And you also have to know when is the time to say, okay, we're going to put this to a vote. We're not going to let this drag out for 10 years. Lastly, part of the reason why templates are not generally a good idea, is because in order for people to really abide by governance documents, it's helpful for them to feel ownership of the documents and feel like they had a hand in it. So a piece of advice is to share credit, even if you as the coordinator feel like you did 90% of the work, really emphasize that 10% that other people worked on. Reference meeting notes where ideas came from so that they can remember, like, oh yeah, I remember that line of thought to why we landed on this instead of this. And just help people feel like these documents are something that they co-created. So one of the big questions that I've gotten a lot is, how the heck do I get my board to care about something as mundane as governance documents, my board or membership or whatever? One of the things which I kind of mentioned in the process piece of this is that typically a small group of champions will kind of come through, of people who really care about governance and understand the importance and are willing to put in the effort. So it's okay to let a small group lead the charge, but just make sure that you're continuing to give everyone the opportunity to engage as much or as little as they want to. And then this piece I liked as well, which is to lead with humor and just come right out and say, I know this isn't the funnest thing in the world, but it's important, and I really appreciate you all showing up. We're going to get through this together. Maybe have some pizza or something to cheer people on. So that's a couple of pieces of advice there as well. So now I'm going to go into the types of documents. This is admittedly probably the least important part of the presentation, in my opinion, because it doesn't really matter what you call the document. It's more about what's included in the document and how useful it is to your group. So, take this with a grain of salt, but often the way that I saw this boil down is there tends to be one core document that kind of lays out the overall structure and function of the group. This is usually called charter or bylaws, or I also saw operating protocols was one that came up a lot. And then there tends to be like a what's our purpose document. So this would be maybe a strategic plan, includes the history of the group, the vision, mission, and values. And then the most variable one is agreement on how we'll work together. And this is where it really gets customized from what I've seen, this is where it really gets customized from group to group. So here's some examples that I saw. Some people have specific documents for decision-making processes, membership applications, community guidelines, zones of agreement. One even had like an emailing guideline that was like, here's when you send group emails, here's when you should just email the coordinator. Like, this is when you really look at what tools are we missing and create that tool. So, next up, I'm going to talk about content that is typically included in governance documents. So this section mostly came from the document analysis of where I dove deep into 17 documents from 8 groups. I'll warn you, this is really dense, but not all collaboratives need all of these things. So the way I broke this down is I created 8 guiding questions, because I feel like maybe having like discussion questions is a little bit easier than just listing content. So here are the 8 guiding questions that I feel might help lead you to the content that would be helpful in governance documents. So the first guiding question is, how will we make decisions? A couple of sub questions here. What does consensus mean in our group? So a big topic that came up a lot under like, where have things gone wrong, is that governance documents will just say, we're going to reach consensus. But nobody knows if consensus is 100% or 75% or 51% or just the board. You get the idea. So what does consensus mean? Who is allowed to vote? Is it specific members? Is it just the steering committee? Are there different levels of agreement, or is it going to be yes or no and there's no in between? Some groups like to have an in between answer of like, yeah, I'll put up with it, but it's not my favorite. And then importantly, what happens if we go through as much deliberation as we can and we simply can't reach our definition of consensus? Does the collaboration dissolve? Do the dissenting members get kicked out? Do the dissenting members get to, put some sort of dissent in the decision? What are you going to do there? Guiding question number 2 is, what are our membership criteria and expectations? Do we even have members? If so, who gets to be a member? Are there different levels of membership or participation that people can choose? What expectations do we set for members? And again, kind of going to the worst case scenario, what will we do if members are not meeting the agreed upon expectations? Number 3 is, what's the basic context, history, and purpose of our group? So what's the basic information that you don't want to lose? Like if the coordinator leaves or the board president leaves, what sort of context do you want future generations to know about your group? And this is also a good time to outline kind of a basic purpose that everybody agrees that you all want to achieve with the group. Number 4 is, how is our group going to be structured? A lot of people or a lot of collaboratives go with a committee structure. If you choose to do that, what is the committee governance going to be like? And as annoying as this might sound, it might be good to go through each of these guiding questions again at the committee level to figure out, who's allowed to join the committee, who votes in the committee, all that fun stuff. How do you add or remove committees as the group changes over time is another thing to consider. The next question is, how do we want to conduct ourselves, particularly in times of conflict? It's pretty much a repeat. Are there basic values or principles that we should all agree on? Like, do we all agree? I don't know, I'm not even going to put examples out there, but are there basic zones of agreement that we should all agree on? Next up, what is our strategy to achieve our goals? This one is fairly straightforward. This is where like a strategic plan often comes in. An important one that I think often gets forgotten is, how and when will we amend each governance document? How often will we amend it? A lot of people recommend doing it on a regular basis so that you're not only doing amendments in times of conflict. But that is an option, is to just amend it as needed. And then what's the process for amending it? Those are things that should be included in the document itself. I think this is the last one, is who has leadership in this group? Is there going to be a board, a steering committee, or does every member have equal power? Whatever works for your group, but it's good to know. If you do choose to have leadership type roles, how are those leadership roles going to be selected and governed? And what are the expectations for them? And once again, what happens if those people are not meeting the expectations that you've laid out? So I know that was actually like, probably 32 guiding questions, but I tried to boil it down into a few guiding questions that I think cover a lot of the key content that goes into governance documents. And then additional things often included, and I know this slide has way too many words on it, but I wanted to make it screenshotable. Vision, mission, values, dates of adoption of the governance document, the geographic context or scope of the collaborative, meeting structure, frequency, timing, record-keeping protocols, media communication guidelines, and definitions for common terms. So these are the types of content that tend to show up in governance documents. And before I go on to the words of advice, I want to just put out a reminder that this is not requirements. This is not me giving you a checklist. It's just, these are things that you might want to consider in creating governance documents. So I'm trying not to overwhelm. Hopefully it's digestible. So a few more words of advice. I guess I kind of just said this. Lots of content that you could include, but just focus on making it usable, practical, and relevant to your specific group. It's going to look different for everyone, what types of information are included and what answers you have to all of those questions. But just make it a tool. There's also a balance. You want it to be prescriptive enough to be actionable, but you also want it to be flexible enough to allow each individual member of the collaborative to have autonomy and also allow for changes to the collaborative over time. And most governance documents are living documents. So, if you find that it's too prescriptive, you can go back and change and adapt. If you find that it's too flexible, go back, change and adapt. It's generally okay. Almost everyone I talked to said that their governance documents had gone through changes due to realizing that something just wasn't quite right, and that's okay. A final word of advice, someone mentioned that they like to keep the protocols in front of them at all the meetings. They were talking about how if you overlook something once, then it kind of sets a bad precedent. And then if you want to go and enforce the governance documents later on, it's kind of, it's like, well, why are you enforcing this one and not this one? So try and follow them and keep them present at all times. Here's my disclaimer again. I put it throughout because I just really feel like this presentation might be overwhelming. So it's not a one size fits all. And I'm going to go through some examples to show you how different groups can do it. So both of these organizations that I'm about to show you said that their governance documents have worked really well for their group, and they gave us permission to use them as examples. The first one is from Boise Forest Coalition. This is a collaborative based in Idaho. We're not going to go through in depth any of this, but I've just highlighted throughout some of the key things that they put in their documents that I've gone through already. So like here they have the board structure and duties. They call it a steering committee. You might call it a board, tomato, tomato. They talk through membership types, membership criteria, and expectations. Here they list out the overarching objectives of the collaborative and kind of the zones of agreement of like, this is what we want to do. They talk about who can vote and what the decision-making process looks like. And then importantly, they talk about what happens if consensus cannot be achieved. And then they talk through how to change this document. And you can see I'm not highlighting everything because they also have additional things that I haven't even talked about, and that's fine. This is the same collaborative. This is another governance document that's kind of a letter to the Forest Service. And that one was super long, so I just bulleted the things that it includes. It talks about their mission, objectives, purpose of the group, the scope of the collaborative, and various asks for the U.S. Forest Service for engaging. So if I pull up my list that I just showed you, I bolded and turned green the ones that were included in the Boise Forest Coalition's governance documents. And as you can see, this collaborative only has about half of those things that I mentioned, and they said it works great for them, and they thought that this was worthy of being an example. So you can have really successful documents and not cover all of the things. So just trying to emphasize that. Another example to kind of compare and contrast, this is the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition, again, sharing with their permission, and they said that these documents work really well for them. So right off the bat, you can see that these ones look really different. They look a lot more formal, but they've got a lot of the same things in them. Here's a big section about board information, membership criteria, representation, elections, vacancies, term limits, some meeting requirements and details. Here they talk about quorum and voting. And then they actually have a board as well as officers. So then this goes into officer roles and requirements and expectations. And then I wanted to highlight these couple of pages, which is kind of the legal stuff required to become an official nonprofit. And I very early on decided that this was outside of the scope of my abilities as I worked through this project. So if you are trying to use the bylaws to become an official nonprofit, there are other considerations that you'll have to make that I'm not covering here. So they have lots and lots of legal stuff. And then at the end, they have the dates that the document was adopted and then dates of any amendments that happened. So this is still Estes Valley Watershed Coalition. As you can see, this document looks a lot more digestible, easy to read, a little bit more human, I think. This is the Board of Directors orientation packet. And so this one is used for orientation when new board members come on. So here they talk about vision, mission, goals, the strategy for the coalition, the history of the organization, board member duties. And then I was laughing, they have 4 pages of acronyms, which is actually makes a lot of sense if you're bringing on a new board member, you got to get familiar with the things you're going to talk about. And this is a good example of how it's a tool. Like, I didn't see something like this in any other documents, but it makes a lot of sense. And clearly it made sense for that group to have this dictionary of acronyms. So again, pulling back to my original list, only a few of these, about half of the things that I mentioned are included in these documents, but they work really, really well. So I wanted to share those in the guide that I release here in a couple of weeks. Hopefully, I'll have actual examples that you can look through at the end of the guide with hopefully lots of disclaimers that you're not supposed to just steal that group's work. So I believe this is the last segment that I have, which is common challenges and mistakes. There really weren't any common challenges and mistakes, to be honest. There were a lot of challenges and there were a lot of revisions that happened, but I didn't see anything that happened like, oh, everybody forgets to add this or everybody faces this problem. It was super variable. The only really consistent response I got, almost word for word, was you don't know until you know. And at some point, you'll encounter some sort of challenge and realize, like, oh, I need to update my documents for this. I did attempt, though, to generalize them to some extent. So I put this little spectrum on here. Most of the challenges that people face tend to be from either being too vague or overly prescriptive. So a couple of examples of being too vague. I mentioned the consensus definition. You really got to kind of nail down that one. Another example is not including board term limits because, at some point that might come up. Membership and voting eligibility, strategic goals being too broad and therefore hard to act on. And then not including consequences for not abiding by the rules. So a lot of groups will have like community guidelines and here's how we're going to act during conflict, but the documents don't actually say what happens if you don't follow those rules. And then lastly, what to do if consensus can't be reached. That was another big one that I have an example about, I think, on the next slide. And then a couple of examples of being too prescriptive. One group was talking about how they made these super specific categories for board representation. Like, we have to have a forester at this level in this job title from this agency. And then if you can't get that specific person, then you don't have a full board. So that one can be kind of tough. Another group mentioned having very specific rules about meeting times and locations and formats. And then when COVID hit, they were like, oh, well, technically we're not allowed to do virtual meetings or we're not allowed to change the times of our meetings. So that might be a little overly prescriptive. And then just kind of a caution is that if things are either too vague or overly prescriptive, then things tend to not be enforced because they're just not realistic. And if things aren't being enforced, then that kind of sets a bad precedent for when you do feel like you need to enforce things. So I've got a slide here kind of outlining a couple of specific stories that I heard. I'm gonna check my time. I'm doing okay. So I've just got 4 real stories here and then examples of how that group revised after that story. So one is this group had a board member who never showed up, never contributed, but per their governance documents, they didn't have a way to remove board members unless board members resigned. So they ended up revising their governance documents to add a board job description that laid out expectations for board members, And then what happens if board members don't meet those expectations. This next one is super common. I guess if I had to choose a common one, it would be that during times of conflict, someone starts acting disrespectfully in meetings. And then I put kind of a secondary one, which is that someone in this particular case joined the collaborative who opposed like the very most basic core values of the group. And they really had no way to not, move forward. So a revision in either or both of these circumstances would be they added community guidelines, including behavioral expectations. So if we're in times of conflict, we're not going to scream at each other. We're going to work through it. And then also in this group's particular behavioral expectations, they also added an agreement to the core vision and mission and values of the group, just to make sure that they're actually working towards something. A third example is full agreement couldn't be reached. And so the one person or organization who was not in agreement ended up leaving the collaborative and going to the media and talking badly about the whole collaborative, which is obviously a really tough situation because, you want them to be able to stick with their values, but you also, need to come, like the whole point of the collaborative is to have this united voice. And so they ended up adding media communication guidelines, as well as they added in a clause where if they really couldn't reach consensus, member groups were allowed to respectfully share their dissent without necessarily going against the entire collaborative. And the last example I'll give, which I feel like this is a common one, is that this organization, their governance documents sat on a shelf untouched, unlooked at, unused for over 5 years because the goals and processes outlined were super vague, really big picture, and it was not able to be used as a tool. So this one is more of a general lesson learned, which is just to reiterate that it's important to use these as a tool. It's not just something that's there to look pretty and feel more formal. They really should be used to guide your day-to-day actions. I don't know how many times I can say that one. So that's the end of my presentation. I appreciate our few people here for sticking through. Again, I know it was super dense, so I want to give plenty of time for questions. And then I also want to hear if anything particularly stuck out as resonating with you, or if you have any tips for ways that I can make a guide really useful and actionable for you. Does anyone have any questions or comments or ideas? Was it totally overwhelming?
I was looking for the hand raise function. I just got a new computer, and like I literally went to join the meeting and I had to load Zoom again before I could get
Oh
going. So I'm
no.
like trying to figure out the new interface. One thing that did stick out, Katie, and that was great. That covered a lot of it. I'm really curious on some of the backstories, just some of these examples that you gave. Sounds quite colorful.
Yeah,
But
I wish I could give like an in-depth background of every single group I talked to because they were so interesting.
the one thing that stood out with the governance documents here in Boulder County is there's like 3 levels. And I pulled all 3 of them up to share the screen, but people probably aren't going to be able to see them. But we have the Boulder County Fire Shed MOU, and we phrase it as an MOU. And basically, that just states that we all agree to play in the same sandbox, get over our differences, et cetera. It is a very broad document. But that being said, when it came time to institute our co-swap project, and I had to get the City of Longmont Conservation District's private landowners on board, and Deanne's on this call as well. She's my Stiller grant accountant. As I talked to our county attorneys, like, what kind of, do we need to drop a contract with these others? And he said, no, actually, that our Boulder County MOU, because it stated all these agencies and what we were going to do, that it says we all need to play together. And so then he was able to build off of that and then come up with a collaborative agreement for our project specifically. And that's where we get into the finance, who's going to contribute what, who's going to do what. Uh, and then in between that, our St. Rain Forest Health Partnership. And I don't know if Kiara sent you the last charter. I know we just had a meeting. She's updating the current charter. But to me, that's almost like the intermediary, even though that kind of came into it. So you have like the overarching county, and then it was to the watershed level, and then it was to the collaborative level when we were actually project specific. Each had a very distinct tier in what they addressed.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I feel like that kind of maybe could help guide. I put that spectrum on there of like you don't want to be too vague, but you don't want to be too
Mhm.
specific. And I was thinking as I was making that, like, well, I don't know if this slide is actually helpful because I don't really know where the sweet spot is. It really depends, but maybe that scale question can kind of help guide that. Like the overarching MOU is a lot more vague, but that's appropriate for that level. And then as you get down, you get more specific and a little bit more prescriptive.
And all three of those are not their own standalone documents either. Each one leans on the other, at least going down to the level of project. In other
Mhm.
words, the same Rainforest Health Partnership refers to and builds off of the Boulder County Fireshed. And then our co-swap project builds off of the St. Rainforest Health Partnership Charter and the Boulder County Fireshed.
Right. Interesting.
Just getting it to that level of specificity. And it seemed to work well so far. Minimal complaints. Nobody went to the media. Well, one guy, but he wasn't involved with us. He's just
Well, yeah, as long as it's
a
not coming
constituent
from
in disagreement. Yes.
within. Yeah, I felt bad when I was hearing that story. I was like, oh no.
Oh, he's still out there. Yeah.
Yeah, anything else particularly stand out or any?
Well, I just wanted to say thanks for all the work of pulling this all together. I think this is going to be a really helpful resource for people. I know that's why I was interested in coming to today because having encountered this enough times now with all the various different collaboratives that I'm involved in, and just for those of you who don't know, Matt Ashley, Aurora Watershed Health, so involved with a lot of different collaboratives that we support and provide funding to for all the various projects that we support. So I feel like the different collaboratives, they're all at varying stages in their maturity. Some of them are newer, some of them are older,
Mhm.
more organized and less organized. So this really helps to bring together a lot of those different levels between the different groups that we're involved in and seeing how they behave, the different groups behave based on their different where they're at in their life cycle, I guess. So I think this is really helpful for me to get my head around some of those ideas, as well as then actually help the groups when we're either creating new documents or updating them. So I think this is going to be really helpful for me personally. And I really liked the guiding questions. I thought those were really helpful and make it a lot more personal and allow you to, just like I said again, kind of whether you're creating a brand new document or just figuring out how to navigate an existing one. I think the guiding questions can be really helpful. So I think that's a really great way to bring it all together. So, and then the last note I had was good idea leaving out the legal stuff. That's why I think that's why you always make sure you have a lawyer on your board. So
Yeah.
that's somebody who can dive into that. So I think that works well for this guide. So those are just kind of my general rambling thoughts. But yeah, mostly thanks for putting this together. I think this is going to be a really great resource.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, the legal stuff. I was nervous when I was asked to create a resource like this because I was like, I'm not a lawyer. I can't do it. And then I realized like most of the stuff actually can be done. But yeah, some of the legal stuff is way over my head. Um,
That's a great point about that. It's like working with county attorneys as much as we do, and they're great. Basically, give them the gist, give them an articulate narrative, and then they will turn it in to the thous and thou shalt nots and the total narrative. But
right.
I've seen a lot of people try and use their own legal language, and that attorneys hate that, right? When lay people try to be somewhat legal and put legalese in there. Yeah, just write your story, what you're trying to accomplish, and then the paralegal or the attorney will do it for you. It'll either be the best money or volunteer effort you ever spent.
So I wrote that down. I think that's a good piece of advice to maybe explicitly include. So I'm curious if you, Scott, you mentioned that Kiara is taking the charge on a revision right now. Have either
Mhm.
of you been like deeply involved in writing or revising documents to date?
No, she took me out and fed me beer and got my input while she was doing all the writing. But I
Okay.
can tell you that the general gist for the revision is that we've grown a lot, right? The roles have become more specific. And just like any good management plan, it should be a living document, right? Adaptive management. And the same should go for your collaborative. So as times went on and we're getting more focused on certain projects and going into this, uh, and we still have issues with it. I stressed is just like trying to be like the grandpa of the group. It's like I want everybody to get along. All right. It's like we're all playing in the same sandbox. This is a beautiful thing. We're actually doing cross-boundary projects with multiple agencies across all kinds of land ownerships, but we need to just get along, you know. We're like a family, and families can be dysfunctional, but we're still a family. And so in that vein, that's kind of what she's going forth with the charter. Definitely more specific than the original one. Definitely outlining roles. Now those roles have become more defined with the various partners that are involved. But yeah, she should have the draft out here pretty soon. I met with her, it was probably like a month ago.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe I should add feed people and take them out for beer as one of my tips for getting people
Uh,
engaged.
if you want to know what the real story is.
Matt, how about you? Have you been like deeply involved in a revision or creation process? Or Nicole, I don't know, maybe with like North Sand Creek, if you guys are working on something there.
I'm about to. So I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on your guide.
Okay, yeah. Do you have like lingering questions after this, or do you feel like this was something that you would be able to really take and do something with?
You definitely have given me a lot to think about, and the guiding questions is fantastic to kind of have a something to work with to guide the questions with the group that has been a very loose collaborative partnership that we're now that we actually have grant money to do things, we realize that we need to like get some of this agreements in place. So yeah, it'll be really helpful.
So yeah, that's what I'm really interested in is like where the rubber meets the road, like how do people find
I'll let
this?
you know how it goes.
Yeah, please do. I'm very interested. You can be another case study.
Yeah.
A really interesting one that I've been working on lately is for the Upper South Platte Partnership. We just got a full-time coordinator last year, and there had not been a coordinator. I don't know if there had ever been a coordinator before that. So kind of going from not having that to having that has been really interesting because the documents were there and the structure was there. It just wasn't necessarily being followed through on. So having that sort of like picked up and brushed off has been a really interesting process to see it kind of like, okay, we've had this stuff for a while, but let's actually work with it in a more meaningful way. So it's been kind of interesting saying, let's revamp some of these things and adjust things. So that's been kind of an interesting like midpoint in the process.
Yeah, I think the coordinator addition or turnover is definitely a time when a lot of people tend to pick them up and really look closely at them, because that person is generally going to be kind of the driving force behind everything. And so they scrutinize them a little more heavily than maybe the volunteer group who's just trying to do it on the side of their regular job. Cool. Well, any other discussion points or anything? I don't want to hold us here if people feel like they got what they needed, but I also am happy to stick around all day long and talk about governance documents since I've learned so much.
where's next year's state collaborative meeting going to be, Katie?
Ooh, good question.
Ooh.
I'll give a little insider tidbit to the people who
Ah,
showed up to this call.
see,
We we just finalized our venue, and so we're going to be getting save the dates out in the next couple weeks once our communications team can get through the Confluence conference that's next week. We are going to be in Durango from
woohoo.
September 4th through 6th. So it's the same weekend as last year, right after Labor Day. And we have so much exciting stuff planned. I can't even tell you how excited I am about it. We're gonna add a couple of like fun activities. Like we're looking at doing a bike ride and a hike the day before, just if you happen to arrive early. And then we're also thinking about potentially doing like some other workshops, like a facilitation workshop. Um, things like that. So I'm super excited and definitely put that on your calendars.
Very cool. That's my hometown, so absolutely.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just east of Durango, Bayfield's where I graduated. But yeah, I grew up all around the
Nice.
Durango area.
Do you still have like family there?
No, everybody's pretty much gone now.
Here we go. Well,
So
hopefully
it
you can
goes.
reminisce while you're there.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. See
That's
if all
great.
the favorite haunts are still around. There's some great forestry that happened and has happened down there and is happening. So should
Yeah,
be
it's
some
a
great.
huge hot spot, especially for collaboration. So
Mhm.
we're excited to highlight some of those projects and hopefully go and visit some of those projects in person.
Yeah, I want to think like the first collaborative project down there. This goes back to like Denny Lynch and Kurt, and it was the Four Corners. It was down Dolores, and it
Mm.
was multiple across Forest Service, private sectors, and it was this whole collaborative down by the Dolores area to try to do restoration of those areas. You might look that. That goes way back. It was successful for a while, but then mill capacity and some other things kind of got in the way. But that's like the first example of multiple agencies getting across a specific landscape to get something done that I know of.
Yeah. Yeah,
Might have
we
been
had
like the
talked
90s.
about doing like a joint paper with CFRI, going through like the history of collaboration in
Hmm.
Colorado. That's a dream for a day when we have more capacity, I think, but
Get there. You're doing a great job.
thanks. All right.
Katie, you've
Anything
given
else?
me a lot to chew on, and I'll definitely, after I've mulled it over a bit, I'll probably pick your brain about it next week when I get to
Yeah,
see you in
please.
person.
Oh, yeah, I'm super excited. Scott or Matt, are either of you, or Deanne, if you're on, are any of you going to Confluence next week in Tucson?
No,
No, dang.
unfortunately not.
Next year or every other year.
Yeah, it's 2026. It'll be in Fort Collins.
Oh, cool. Well, then surely you guys will come. Awesome. Yeah, Nicole, definitely keep me updated on your progress and like really any like real feedback that any of you have. I really want to make this useful. I want to make it worth everybody's time, and I'm happy to do revisions and make it a living document, as we know, as things should be. So yeah, if you get a chance to use it, please let me know. And thank you so much for sticking around and some conversation.